Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling and unexplained cases ever documented in the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We are interested to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. In the summer of 1844, something began in Vicksburg, Mississippi, that would challenge everything the wealthy landowners of the region believed about the world, about human nature, and about the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural. It started with whispers among field hands and house servants, spread to the offices of physicians and clergymen, and eventually reached the highest circles of Mississippi society, where it would remain a closely guarded secret for more than a century. The story centers on two young women who would become known as Dahlia and Lily, twin sisters whose very existence seemed to defy the natural order. Born from the same womb, yet appearing as opposites, night and day made flesh, Dahlia possessed skin described in auction records as dark as Mississippi soil after rain, with eyes that seemed to hold depths no human gaze should contain. Lily, her twin, was afflicted, or perhaps blessed, with a condition the medical men of the era called leucism. Her skin pale as moonlight, her hair white as cotton blossoms, her eyes a peculiar pale amber that seemed to shift color depending on the light. Together, they formed a duality that observers found profoundly disturbing. Not because of their contrasting appearances alone, though that was remarkable enough, but because of something in their presence, in the synchronized way they moved, in the identical intensity of their gazes, that suggested they were not truly two separate beings, but rather two manifestations of a single, incomprehensible entity. This is not a story of romance or desire, in any conventional sense. This is a chronicle of fear, obsession, and inexplicable phenomena that surrounded two women whose very existence seemed to mock the rigid racial categories upon which Southern society was built. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from plantation records, medical journals, church documents, and personal diaries that remained hidden in private collections until recently. The first documented reference to the twins appears in the ledger of the Riverside Auction House in Natchez, Mississippi, dated June 14, 1844. The entry is unusual in several respects. Unlike typical slave auction records, which provided detailed physical descriptions to establish value, this entry contains only a brief notation. Twin females approximately 20 years of age, one of pure complexion, one afflicted with white condition, origin unknown, sold as single lot to intermediary for Belmont interests. Price withheld from public record. The selling price, when it was finally discovered in private Belmont family papers in 1967, was staggering $18,000, at a time when a strong field hand might sell for $1,500, and even the most accomplished house servant rarely exceeded $3,000. What made these particular women worth such an extraordinary sum? Reverend Samuel Hutchkins, a Methodist minister, who happened to be in Natchez that June day, recorded his impressions in a journal that would not be made public until his great-grand and daughter donated it to the Mississippi Historical Society in 1952. He wrote, "I have witnessed many unfortunate souls sold into bondage, a practice I find increasingly difficult to reconcile with Christian teaching. But today I saw something that troubled me in an entirely different manner." The twin women on the block stood side by side, holding hands, creating a visual contrast so stark it seemed almost supernatural. One dark as night, one pale as death itself. Yet their faces were identical in every feature. They did not weep or plead as so many do. They simply stood, with a composure that seemed almost otherworldly, and observed the crowd with eyes that appeared to see far more than they should. What disturbed me most was that they moved in perfect synchronization, as though connected by invisible threads. When one breathed, the other breathed. When one turned her head, the other mirrored the movement exactly. The Belmont family was among the most powerful in Mississippi. They controlled 3 massive plantations totaling more than 15,000 acres, held significant political influence in both state and national Democratic Party circles, and maintained business connections throughout the South and into New York banking houses. Whatever motivated them to pay such an Unprecedented sum for the twins, it was not a casual whim. Unlike every other enslaved person purchased by the Belmont interests that year, Dahlia and Lily were not sent to work in the cotton fields or even the main household staff. Instead, according to architectural records and servant testimonies collected decades later, they were housed in a specially prepared section of the Belmont mansion itself in what had previously been a storage wing on the third floor, accessible only through a single locked corridor. This arrangement generated immediate speculation. Plantation owners simply did not house enslaved individuals within the family living quarters except for the most trusted house servants, and even then only in designated servant areas. To dedicate an entire wing to two newly acquired people suggested either extraordinary favor or extraordinary caution. The truth, as later evidence would suggest, was the latter. The Belmont family was not indulging the twins. They were containing them. The first indication that something was profoundly wrong came in August 1844, barely 2 months after the twins' arrival. Dr. William Ashford, the family physician who maintained detailed records of all medical matters concerning the Belmont household, was summoned to examine injuries both sisters had sustained. His report, preserved in the archives of the Vicksburg Medical Society, contains observations that he clearly struggled to explain. I was called to attend to lacerations on the left forearms of both females known as Dahlia and Lily. The wounds appeared identical in location, depth, and length, which was peculiar given that they had supposedly been injured in separate incidents. More remarkable still, based on the initial report from Mrs. Belmont's housekeeper, the wounds were approximately 48 hours old. However, upon examination, I found the injuries had healed to a degree that would typically require at least 7 to 10 days. The scar tissue was mature, the inflammation entirely absent, and both subjects reported no pain or limited mobility. Dr. Ashford's report continued with increasingly disturbed observations. What troubles me most is not merely the accelerated healing, but the absolute symmetry between the two subjects. When I examined Dahlia's pulse, it measured approximately 48 beats per minute. Lily's pulse, measured simultaneously by my assistant, was exactly the same. And, more remarkably, the beats occurred in perfect synchronization, as though both hearts were controlled by a single mechanism. When I tested their reflexes, responses occurred at precisely the same instant in both subjects. I attempted to engage them in separate examinations, placing them in different rooms, but both became severely agitated, exhibiting rapid breathing and signs of distress until they were reunited. The doctor's final observation revealed his deep unease. I must note, though it seems improper to record such a subjective impression in a medical document, that I found the subject's presence profoundly unsettling. The effect of their dual gaze, one from eyes dark as night, one from eyes pale as milk, was deeply disturbing. I left the Belmont residence with an inexplicable sense of unease that persisted for several days. The enslaved community in Vicksburg developed its own understanding of the twins, passed through whispered conversations in quarters, and during the brief periods of communal gathering permitted on Sundays. An elderly woman named Claudia, interviewed in 1932 when she was 97 years old, recalled her time as a house servant on a plantation neighboring the Belmont estate. She said, "We knew not to speak their names, where white folks could hear, but among ourselves we called them the night and day flowers because one bloomed in darkness and one in light, but they was the same flower split in two." The old women said they wasn't altogether of this world, said something had touched their mama before they was born, something that marked them for a purpose we couldn't understand. The dogs knew it. Dogs always know. They would whimper and hide when the twins came near. Even the meanest fighting dogs would tuck tail and look away. But here's the strange part. The dogs couldn't decide which one scared them more. They'd look at the dark one and whine, then look at the pale one and shake. Another account recorded in 1928 from a man named Isaiah, who had been enslaved on the Belmont property, provided additional details. Miss Dahlia and Miss Lily, they never worked a day that I saw. They kept them up in that east wing, and sometimes you'd see them at the window, always standing together, always touching, like they couldn't bear to be separated even by an inch. But it was the smell that told you when they'd been somewhere. Two smells, actually, coming together. One sweet like night blooming flowers, dark and heavy, the other light and clean like magnolia in the morning. But when those two smells mixed together, it made something else entirely, something that turned your stomach while it drew you in. The phenomenon of the dual scent appears in numerous accounts from various sources. In September 1844, Judge Marcus Bellamy, a circuit court judge and close associate of the Belmont family, recorded in his private diary, attended dinner at the Belmont residence. Throughout the evening, I was aware of unusual fragrances seemingly coming from different parts of the house simultaneously. One was sweet and floral, dark and intoxicating, while the other was lighter, almost ethereal. As the night progressed, these scents seemed to merge and intensify. When I mentioned it to Charles Belmont, he became noticeably uncomfortable and changed the subject. By the autumn of 1844, the situation at the Belmont mansion had apparently become serious enough to warrant outside intervention. This is when the family made the fateful decision to involve the church, specifically requesting the assessment of Reverend Thaddeus Price, a Baptist minister known for his stern moral views and his reputation for spiritual discernment. Reverend Price's encounter with the twins is documented in fragments of his own diary that survived despite his later attempts to destroy his papers. The entry is dated November 3, 1844. I was summoned to the Belmont estate to provide spiritual counsel regarding a matter they described as delicate. Upon arrival, I was taken to the third floor east wing to a suite of rooms where I was introduced to the twin women known as Dahlia and Lily. They sat together on a settee holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a manner that seemed almost ritualistic. The contrast between them was stark. One possessed of the darkest complexion I have ever observed, rich and seemingly luminous, the other so pale she appeared almost translucent, like a ghost or spirit made flesh. Yet their faces were identical in every feature, mirror images that somehow emphasized rather than diminished their opposition. The diary continues, what disturbed me most was the sensation I experienced when both turned their gazes upon me simultaneously. One pair of eyes dark and fathomless, one pair pale and penetrating, but both looking at me with the exact same expression, the exact same intensity. I had the most peculiar sensation, as though their dual gaze was reaching into my mind from two directions at once, extracting memories that I had long buried. I thought of my brother dead these 20 years, and of the circumstances of his passing. I thought of words I had spoken in anger to my wife, words I had never confessed to anyone. All of this rushed through my consciousness in the space of seconds, and I had the terrible suspicion that they were aware of every thought, that together they were reading my soul like a book open before them. The entry grows more disturbed. I attempted to engage them in conversation about spiritual matters. When Dahlia finally spoke, her words were not those of an ignorant or uneducated person. She said in a voice that seemed to resonate with deep tones, "Reverend, you speak of sin and salvation." Then, Lily continued, her voice higher and clearer, but perfectly synchronized with her sister's rhythm. "But what if there are souls that exist outside that framework? Then together in perfect unison, they said, what if there are people who were never meant to be saved or damned, who simply are?" The effect of their combined voices speaking as one was profoundly unsettling. What happened next is described in a subsequent entry dated November 5, 1844, written in noticeably shaken handwriting. I preach this Sunday on the theme of resisting temptation, as I have done countless times before, but when I reached the pulpit and looked out at the congregation, I found I could not continue with my prepared sermon. Instead, I heard myself saying words I had not planned. I said, "Do not fight against the temptation, for it is already among us, walking in two forms, speaking with two mouths, seeing with four eyes." The congregation sat in stunned silence. I cannot explain what came over me. I felt as though I was standing outside my own body, watching myself speak words that were not mine. Reverend Price resigned from his pulpit in December 1844, citing health concerns. He never ministered again. His wife, in a letter to her sister, wrote, "Thaddeus is not the man he was." Something happened during his visit to that arsed house. He wakes at night in terror. And sometimes I hear him weeping. And speaking of mirrors and shadows and twins who were really one. He says we are not safe, that there are things walking in the world that should not be. I fear greatly for his sanity. The impact of the twins' presence was not limited to those who met them directly. Throughout the winter of 1844 and spring of 1845, a series of inexplicable events plagued the families and businesses associated with the Belmont interests. Charles Belmont's business partner, Richard Thornton, died suddenly of an apparent stroke at age 42. His widow mentioned in her private correspondence that in the weeks before his death, Richard had become obsessed with the mirror problem at the Belmonts and had begun covering all the mirrors in their home. The overseer at one of the Belmont plantations, Thomas McKinley, began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. In March 1845, according to testimony from other plantation employees, McKinley claimed he could hear two voices speaking in harmony at night, singing words in a language he did not recognize. He told his wife that he had seen the twins standing at the edge of the cotton fields at dusk, though the Belmont family insisted they never left their third F floor or rooms. On May 3, 1845, Thomas McKinley was found dead in his quarters from what was ruled a heart attack. His final journal entry contained only a single sentence written and rewritten dozens of times. They are not two. They are not two. They are not two. Most disturbing was the case of James Belmont, Charles's younger brother, who managed the family's cotton gin operations. In April 1845, James became convinced that the twins were somehow responsible for a series of mechanical failures. He told his wife that he had seen them standing in the doorway of the facility one evening, and as he watched, they had stepped toward each other, and their silhouettes had overlapped, creating a shadow that was neither wholly dark nor wholly light. 2 weeks later, James Belmont was discovered in his office with his service pistol beside him, dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He left no formal note, but on his desk was found a piece of paper with a crude drawing showing two female figures, one shaded dark, one left white, with an equal sign followed by a single figure that was half dark and half light. Below the drawing were the words, "God help us when they remember they are one." It was after James's death that the Belmont family made the decision to invite scientific examination of the twins. Dr. Adrian Rowley was a physician from New Orleans with advanced medical training in European institutions. He was brought to Vicksburg in June 1845, under conditions of strict confidentiality, paid a substantial fee, and given unusual latitude to conduct examinations that would not have been permitted under normal circumstances. Dr. Rowley's research journal, discovered in 1973 in a private collection in Louisiana, provides clinical details that read like something from a Gothic novel. His entry from June 28, 1845, describes an experiment with blood transfusion. I have conducted a series of tests to determine whether there exists any physiological connection between the subjects beyond their obvious genetic relationship. When I drew blood from Dahlia and introduced it into Lily's system, not only was there no adverse reaction, but Lily's vital signs began to synchronize even more perfectly with Dahlia's than before. More remarkable still, when I reversed the procedure, the same synchronization occurred. It was as though each transfusion strengthened the connection between them. A subsequent entry reveals even more disturbing findings. When the Sioux